All right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock here on the Eastern Coast. My name is Seema Iyer and I oversee the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And we are talking this whole week about a series of issue briefs that we created for the Baltimore Community Change project. And today we're talking about the fourth issue brief on accessibility and mobility with two wonderful respondents to the issue brief, Robert Goodspeed from the University of Michigan and Celeste Chavis from Morgan State University right here in Baltimore. So let me tell you a little bit about the project and a little bit about us, and then we will get into this particular one. The Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance here in Baltimore has been around for 20 years. We issue what's called the Vital Signs Report for all neighborhoods in the city and provide quality of life measures to track progress over time. We are part of the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is a learning network of 30 cities around the country learning about how to create community-based indicators for cities just like Baltimore. When the 2020 census came out, even though we have all this information about neighborhoods, the most important indicator that we can get from the 2020 census is, of course, small geography population totals. Whether we believe the actual number or not, I think what we can do is really look at the trend. We know that there's issues around census potential undercount, but Baltimore was the only city on the East Coast to lose any population at all. We lost 5.7% of our overall population, which becomes the 7th decade in a row for our city to be losing population. And like I mentioned, no other city on the East Coast lost population. And in fact, if you look at the 2020 census, this was the decade of metropolitan gain and the worst decade of rural loss in the nation's history. So Baltimore is unfortunately bucking a trend and not in company with almost any other city in the country, but especially here on the East Coast. Philadelphia posted its biggest gain in 70 years. Newark, New Jersey posted a 12.4% increase. So we have a lot to learn from other cities here on the East Coast. And I think you're going to find that this particular topic of this particular issue brief on mobility and accessibility is probably our biggest Achilles heel, especially being on the East Coast. So even though we lost 5.7% of our population, that population loss was not even, of course. And for those of us that are in Baltimore, this is unfortunately a very common pattern that I'm going to talk about. The areas in blue are the ones that grew in the city, and the areas in red were the ones that declined in terms of population. And the bluer, the more increase that we had, and the more red, the more decrease. And for, again, those of us in Baltimore, the blue areas are precisely going up and down the spine of the center of the city, which Dr. Lawrence Brown from Morgan State has coined the term the white L. These are predominantly non-persons of color neighborhoods. And the areas in red are predominantly African-American, which Dr. Brown calls the wings of the city, the black butterfly. One thing to note, though, is even though predominantly white neighborhoods are the ones that grew, they became much more diverse over this decade. And in fact, if your neighborhood grew in the city of Baltimore, it's because African-Americans moved in. African-Americans are moving in precisely these areas that are now in the blue as well. But they're also leaving places that are in the red. So there's obviously, looking at areas of opportunity, both inside the city and in the region. And why can we have this continued kind of pattern? If you look at this map between 2010 and 2020, it's almost the identical map of the one from 2000 to 2010. The same neighborhoods that grew in the previous decade grew again, and practically the same neighborhoods that declined again. And so this becomes a robust pattern. And when you think about robust patterns, this is exactly predictability that we might get from some type of network effect, which neighborhoods are. We know neighborhoods are basically a series of different networks put together. And I think that what we're seeing in our city is essentially that kind of predictable effect. So we're coining another term ourselves based on the research that we have called enduring divergence. So enduring, it's coming from this idea from Robert Sampson that places have enduring properties that we can see in the data. And Divergence is coming from Enrico Moretti, talking about how different places are experiencing divergent economic fortunes. And we can see that kind of enduring divergence happening right in our own city, which is not something that any of us can afford ethically, psychologically, financially, to have this kind of pulling apart going on in our city. So the neighborhoods that are declining, again, are declining because they are disconnected physically, which is what we're going to be talking about today, through our transit and transportation system. But you'll also find that they're disconnected digitally, socially, and financially. And of course, this begets a vicious cycle. Once you get disconnected, it becomes only more disconnected over time. And as Dr. Brown calls it, this is disproportionately impacting existing neighborhoods of color. So in his own words, Black lives are not going to matter until Black neighborhoods matter. And we can clearly see that in the data that we're going to show. So that's the purpose of the Baltimore Community Change Project. We want this data to be empowering. We want to end this kind of divergence and use the data to try and help communities really track that over time. And we have a series of events in March going on, which we'll talk about. But today we wanted to focus on one of the 6 issue briefs that we wrote. Today, issue brief number 4 about accessibility and mobility. And quick takeaways from this particular issue brief is, that 45 commute time is essentially an urban disamenity. If we have too many people traveling that far in the middle of a city, that becomes something that is kind of pulling people away from our city. So the 45-minute commute time is clearly correlated with population loss by neighborhood. Long commute times are predominantly occurring in neighborhoods with high African-American populations, also high rates of unemployment, and interestingly, lack of digital access at home. Maybe thinking that if I'm traveling so far, I don't necessarily need to pay for the access at home because I'm not going to be home that much, which of course has other implications to anybody else living in that household. And then of course, the long commute time is clearly correlated with reliance on public transportation and no vehicle access at home. So one of the other key findings is we clearly have a spatial mismatch where people are traveling out from the county into the city to work and from the city out to the county. And it's very clear that this trend is happening right in that east-west corridor. So if we see where we lost population here on the left side is exactly where we saw more people traveling outside the city to go to work. That's what the red label means. And then that's also happening on the east side. Severe population loss, also more people traveling outside the city to get to work. So the travel outside the city to get to work seems to be a pull factor. If you're going to travel that far, one of the first things you're going to do to keep your job is to move closer to your job. And then we know that this is a moment for us to be thinking about infrastructure, especially along this east-west corridor. And the question is, will our infrastructure focus really change this dynamic and kind of finally get Baltimore more of a network rather than this kind of solo lines that we have right now. But obviously we have experts beyond me on this particular topic, and we want to really thank our respondents, Celeste Chavis from Morgan State University and Robert Goodspeed. I'm going to start with Celeste, who is our local expert, and have you start to kind of give some thoughts about what you read, and we will put Celeste's full bio in the chat. But Dr. Celeste Chavis is Associate Professor appointed in the Departments of Transportation and Urban Infrastructure and Civil Engineering at Morgan State University. Thanks, Celeste, for being here.
Thanks for having me. So the report was wonderful. I definitely got some interesting things out of it. I think the thing that I thought was most interesting, you kind of already touched on a bit, and I think that's the importance of creating access to livable wage jobs. It's interesting that the neighborhoods which are experiencing population loss are also correlated to the neighborhoods that have lower vehicle access and longer commutes. And I think that emphasizes the importance of not only connecting to jobs, but making sure that those jobs connect to that they match the skill sets of the neighborhoods, and that they are actual livable wage jobs, and that they are jobs that are reachable to people in that community. And so I think that was probably the greatest takeaway. I thought it was interesting looking at Old Town in Middle East, which experienced quite a bit of change over the last decade. In case anybody's not from Baltimore who's on there, that's a neighborhood that's gone through a lot of development, and it's next to Johns Hopkins. And I found it interesting because we see that the impact of that development is really kind of changing the demographics of who's living there, and maybe not necessarily bringing additional jobs to those who already live there. We can see that, in fact, car ownership, more people own cars after that development, even though people have shorter commutes, more people are walking to the job. So I thought that was really interesting, and kind of looking at what are some of the impacts of these development projects when it comes from the idea of transportation and access. And so those are probably the two things that stood out to me the most.
Yes, and yeah, just looking at where we have these clusters of high people working outside the city, they are right next to our job centers in the city, right next to downtown, or right next to the Hopkins Hospital, which is the Old Town Middle East area. Let me turn it over to Robert. Thanks you for being here. Robert Goodspeed is the Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, my alma mater. We're so happy to have you here.
Yeah, and thanks for the invitation, Seema. I think projects like this, as a professional is involved in indicators work in Boston, are so important to translate that census data to what you've done, like locally sensible, like neighborhood boundaries, and then monitor change, and really like get people to talk about the trends even when they're uncomfortable or run counter to what the politicians kind of feel is happening. I would say when I read through the brief, I felt very at home. I've been out. Is my 9th year here in the Midwest, and so I obviously studied Detroit, and I've been very intensively working on a mobility project in the Benton Harbor St. Joe region, which is a small post-industrial city on the Lake Michigan shore. And sadly, your city with underinvested transit, with really a failure to stabilize the most distressed neighborhoods and a failure to ensure uniform high quality of life, is very typical to many U.S. cities. And I felt right at home, sadly, as I read through it. And I want, really at a macro, you have a tale of two cities, which is typical, where you have disinvested or underinvested transit networks. You have a city that has working pretty well for car owners and for those who are proximate to freeway infrastructure, and for those who can't afford cars or their car breaks down and are transit dependent, they have much fewer jobs, much less accessibility. And the data, it's very vivid in your data. That exact dynamic plays out in the Midwest, where we have underdeveloped transit as well. So I would say kind of two reactions to offer. Like, one, a lot of your analysis is focusing on commuting and where jobs are. I mean, that's rightfully very important. I think you would know if you broaden that and you looked at non-work travel. If you think about it, as a lot of folks not in the labor market because they're retired, they're older, families with children, and so their travel needs are even more complex than just getting to a job. They have to get to schools, they have to get to medical appointments, they have to get to daycares, grocery stores. And so like that, we've been wrestling with that with our project, really the tension between expanding access to job, but also serving buildings full of elderly people who, for their top priority, is getting to medical appointments and getting to the grocery store. So I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that. I just want to point out to everyone, if you were to include that or look at that, you might discover even greater problems. And then we discover there are changes in the school system or the accessibility of all those services that compounds the problem. And then, the other kind of observation I'll offer is, really we have this new thing called ride sharing. Everyone's very excited about it. Everyone's got the app on their phone. Well, I don't blame you for neglecting it. Like, actually it's expensive, so it doesn't really serve the working poor. But there's a lot of claims and a lot of hopes that those technologies and those ideas can be either adopted by transit agencies or through innovative pilots somehow make an impact onto these glaring transportation challenges that you document in Baltimore that we know we have in the Midwest. And so I mean, number one, perhaps you could learn more about what, who's using it and for what purposes in Baltimore. And number two, my hunch would be it's probably not really being fully leveraged as a solution. And so, I think we move beyond the phase where there's a thought we don't need traditional transit anymore. It's just a pure mobility kind of world. But like I've been doing a lot of work in that space, and I think what is exciting where transit agencies are being more innovative and flexible and creating, rail where rail makes sense, creating different bus services where they have densities, and filling gaps and serving new riders through flex or on-demand systems. But at the end of the day, there's not a magic button. Somebody still has to pay for the different infrastructures, and it still has to be a funding priority. So those were some thoughts that occurred to me as I read through your work, and look forward to hearing your reactions.
No, thank you very much, Cecile. I know Celeste has done a lot of work around the non-work travel, but the school-based travel and how our system has not really helped our children get to school on time. I don't know if you want to talk about that and if you saw any neighborhood differences there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't focus too much on the students when I was reading it, but what did, I guess, stand out is the fact that we underwent a system redesign during this 10-year period, and the fact that that has not translated in the indicators that we saw. And so I think that speaks a bit towards the fact that student commutes are still challenging in the city, and they've remained challenging. And I'd be interested to see if that factors into people's choice in deciding where they live, for example, and if they even stay in the city to reside as part of the complications associated with student commutes here in Baltimore.
And then the key, I lived in the Midwest for many years, but being on the East Coast and not being able to be competitive with having a transit system is clearly hurting us. If we look at what's the difference between a Baltimore and a Philadelphia or a Newark, New Jersey, there's not much difference. We could talk about crime in all those cities. We could talk about, educational systems in all those cities. The biggest difference is that you can get around in those cities without a car. You can live in Washington, D.C. without a car, or New York City, obviously, without a car. And that's not happening in Baltimore. And so if you come looking for that kind of an urban amenity, it's like, you're not going to find it in Baltimore. We actually have many people that have moved from New York City to Baltimore and say, where's the transit? It doesn't exist. And so to your point, Robert, maybe there's, maybe a silver lining is that maybe we dodged a bullet. We don't have the white elephant of much fixed rail in the city. What are the kind of maybe modern day 21st century on demand? What could a city like Baltimore throw the gauntlet down and say, we want to be the #1 on demand transit system in the planet? What would that look like?
I don't know if that was a proposal or a question, but yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, one of the collaborators on my on the project I'm leading is an engineer, and he's a proponent of mixed systems that use flexible shuttles for last mile, but then rely on bus rapid transit or traditional scheduled bus routes for as a kind of spine of the system. And so he's very keen to develop this, but this is obviously like a major paradigm shift for like American transit agencies. And so the way he's advanced his work tends to be he's engaged in a major pilot with MARTA, which is an on-demand pilot in certain areas that are underserved by their traditional services. But I don't think I think he would dream about redesigning the whole system. So I think there is a potential there. I mean, but I think but also there is just some fundamental economics. Even if it's a fairly inexpensive vehicle, if you have very low rider numbers, which the flex transit models almost require, it's per ride or per mile is not going to be as efficient. So the transportation land use connection means you can look to either side, and I would say the land use strategy is about. Of course, trying to identify and stabilize certain neighborhoods, opportunities for increasing density. As I think it's fascinating you're documenting, the population is kind of shifting around the city, moving towards different neighborhoods for different reasons. And that suggests, like, how do you coordinate your transit investments with with a kind of, investment strategy. And now you have to get all neighborhoods to buy into that. But I think in Detroit, they now have a strategic neighborhood investment fund that's identified key nodes throughout the city for more density for commercial amenities and so forth. And then kind of selling it by explaining that it's going to benefit the surrounding neighborhoods by creating like a node that they can access that provides services. And then that provides more of a framework for that, to more easily provide transit to get people through the city. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but those are some ideas that come to mind about that. And I try to strike a middle balance. I'm all for smart pilots, but I don't think it's a silver bullet at the end of the day. I think it's just another tool that we need to put in along with the traditional planning, traditional methods.
I mean, it's a great point that, and then this is why the Tale of Two Cities exists, right? As Celeste said, we have, we seem to be doing just fine in neighborhoods where if you have a car, like actually those neighborhoods are booming. Or if you can walk to work, we have we have many neighborhoods that actually saw the walking to work increase, and they're exactly where we have, population gain, which is exactly an urban amenity. This is what people think about when they come to a city, that you could walk around and have everything you need for even those non-work trips. But we have this kind of shift, and the shift is only continuing to reinforce itself, right? We have more and more people going into the same neighborhoods, which of course causes other kind of problems with congestion. And more people wanting cars because they now have, more congestion, which is such an urban kind of an irony, right? In the middle of a city that we have more and more people having a car. I don't know, Celeste, have you kind of looked at the new bus, the change in the bus system that did occur in the middle of this decade? And then thinking about, Michelle Wu in Boston is talking about free bus. What would that look like in the city if we took our existing system and just made it free if you're a Baltimore resident?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the free bus. I mean, I think it's a very interesting concept. I'm actually looking forward to seeing some of these cities who are trying that, what happens. I think free bus is an answer to some problems, but not all. Free fare doesn't speed up the bus. And if there's still very big differences in travel time by car and by bus, that may not be the solution that we need to see modal shifts. It definitely will lessen the burden on some and may open up where certain job markets may open up for some individuals, but I think we will still see the problem of drastically different travel times by car versus by bus. And so I think that it'll have to be a multi-pronged approach if we're really trying to address some of the congestion concerns we have, whether it be investing in other modes of transportation like biking for our close trips, looking at more high capacity transit options, such as rail, and then just looking at like some of the land use things of maybe trying to have some of those job centers where we can have targeted investment, where we have rapid transit access to some key areas throughout the city and even some locations outside of the city. So I think free fares is interesting, but I don't think it's a solution to all of our transit problems.
Did you were from Boston originally, Robert, any thoughts on free fare in Boston or free fare for neighborhoods like ours?
Yeah, no, I'm not actually from Boston. I did live there for 5 years. So I think Celeste hit the nail on the head. If the cost of transit, some of it is the fare, but a lot of it is in time. And so, the free fare solves one part, but for a lot of folks, that's only when folks like Celeste model travel choice. Often what's determining the total cost is the time, not it's not necessarily the out-of-pocket expense of the mode, whether it's getting on a bus or gassing up your car, although that's part of the formula. I would say I'm going to introduce something else, which is that an area I've done a lot of work is this methodology called scenario planning, and we're talking about, it seems so overwhelming. You have all these options for your transit system. You also have options for your land use system and where you densify and what's going on. And so I found that practitioner projects that use scenarios to look at that, you know, how uncertain all of those are, and then look at possible combinations, and then look at how they perform and try to estimate through models, a really useful professional method to organize that and to consider, like, really what you're talking about is more fundamental transformative improvements that you know, a lot of folks agree are needed, but there's so many avenues or ways to begin. And so in our project, in this, they keep talking about this Benton Harbor project, it's, you know, a mixed methods, trying to come up with all these ideas and data, and we've zeroed in on some possible new bus routes, random through models. We're going to have a workshop where everyone can look at that. And so that's one way. And in fact, the founder of a tool we've used known as Remix was hired by Michelle Wu. I'm blanking on her name, but I'll think of it in a moment. And so there's a thought they might, you know, there's the Boston connection. But, you know, so when it comes to infrastructure planning, like you know, think unfortunately a lot of the projects, it's, you know, should you have rail or not? And there's champions for the rail, and there's the trade union and the mayor who's into that. But what the planning question needs to zoom out and to look at different combinations of things and have that strategic consensus about, all right, you know, if we coordinate land use certain ways, certain types of modes will make sense and we should do it. And that's how you avoid making investments that don't have the benefit that you hope. And so I have no idea what's happening locally, but more than happy to sell that snake oil. And anyway, I could send you my articles. And no, so I think it's not only me, it's really a lot of cities, I think, are realizing if you're really unhappy with their current pattern, a function of structural institutionalized racism and all of the legacy of auto-centric decision-making, then you need a framework to look at those alternatives and have those conversations. And that's, you know, I think scenario planning is often used in a more limited kind of technical way, but I think it can be pushed into more, you know, more honest ways. And I think it's great you led with race, that in some ways racism and racial segregation are at the root of a lot of this, so that you can't ignore that and just keep treating it like a technical problem moving people, because what's driving the decisions and what's driving the origins of and the depth of the inequality that you're trying to disrupt, you have to kind of grapple with. And so, yeah, those are some thoughts I had about just light, casual things.
No, that's absolutely a great point. And Celeste, maybe I'll end with you this idea. You know, even to begin the process of scenario planning here in Baltimore, you would need some type of decision maker to make that choice, right? To lead that cause. And, you know, in Baltimore, we unfortunately have a very stunted and kind of disenfranchising process of decision making in transportation, because it's at the state level rather than the regional level. And I don't know, Celeste, do you see that changing anytime soon?
I think there's definitely a kind of grassroots effort that does have some local political backing to change that. We see that there's a state bill that's out right now looking to look at the possibility of a regional transit authority that would then essentially provide a board that the governor would have to answer to when making transit decisions. We are one of the few large cities that has this setup where we have a governor who can make these decisions without at least having some oversight by the local jurisdictions with which the transit is going through. And I think if that can change, we will definitely see, it'll allow the transit practitioners to really plan for the future and kind of use these trends that, you know, that you guys have seen over the last 10, 20 years, and being able to plan into the future for transit, which I think is what's lacking in the city. You know, we can plan, but if it's based on who's in administration to get things accomplished, then that's not ideal, especially given the fact that, you know, major transit projects take 10, 20 years to even come to fruition. And so we could be looking at 2, 3, 4 different administrations that have to all be on one accord to see something like that happen. And that's no way to plan a city.
And by 2030, we will show you the same exact map, unfortunately, with this kind of. So one of the things that we're hoping to do, thank you so much, Robert and Celeste, for being with us, is what we want to try and do is how do we show neighborhoods what the data is telling us, but then also really reflect on our shared fate right? We cannot have where some neighborhoods are growing like gangbusters and some neighborhoods are declining in the same city and think that all of us are going to be okay. None of us are going to be okay in that scenario. In that scenario, literally it's happening right now. So over the next week, we are going to have a series of conversations. We hope everyone on this call will join us. Please pick one where we can start really writing down people's solutions, and everything that maybe we talked about today could be then presented to our elected officials and everybody in neighborhoods that have leaders in them. We have neighborhood trivia nights. We love it if you come to join us there. And we have lots of other ways for you to stay connected with us even beyond next week, with all of the data that we've provided here and our ongoing work on monitoring quality of life and data. Thanks everybody for being here, and I'm going to stop the recording.